I'm Steve Hayward, and I teach in the English department here at Colorado College. I'm also Associate Director of North American Studies and a Canadian. I was born in Toronto, raised in Toronto, and like most Torontonians, I've abandoned any hope of the Leafs ever winning the Stanley Cup. Excuse me, that was a Canadian joke. Living here in Colorado Springs, Colorado, one of the questions I get asked all the time is from Americans who are thinking of moving to Canada. I've grown accustomed to hearing both left and right-leaning Americans vow to move to Canada each time they perceive a new last straw on the cultural or political front, or even economic front. Whether it's a lost election, whether it's a raise in taxation, whether it's cheap prescription drugs, whether it's simply discontent with the Denver Broncos, each time Americans decide they're fed up and not going to take it anymore, they declare that it's time to move to Canada. Don't get me wrong, America is a rich and complicated country, a diverse country, and Americans are a complicated people about whom it's difficult to generalize. But if there is one thing that can be said for certain about all Americans, at least all public radio listening Americans, it's that it's only a matter of time before they think seriously about heading up north of the border. And indeed, the decision to move to Canada does make a lot of sense. Why wouldn't disillusioned Americans consider heading north of the border? We all speak the same language. We all shop at the Gap and Costco. We both have reliable toilets. And we all watch Downton Abbey on Sunday nights and idealize the British upper classes. There's even a Target in Canada. A Target! But the fact is that Canada can be a scary and confusing place, particularly for Americans who often arrive with the expectation that Canada will be, well, America. And so with that in mind, I thought I'd offer a short micro-lecture on the subject, a kind of useful primer that you can access at some perhaps not too distant moment in the future when you, like most of your fellow Americans, will decide to fly the coop. A kind of preview of the mildly jarring, potentially disorienting changes that are in store for the fed-up, fired-up immigrant who just wants to live out her life on the peaceful, pro-Kyoto, anti-war side of the Great Lakes. First of all, there's the little things. It's not Z, it's Z. And it's not a hat on your head, it's a toque. It's not a mile, it's a kilometer. When a Canadian holds the door open for you and you thank them, the Canadian will reply by saying, "You're welcome." Americans say, "Uh-huh." Try to not be offended or confused by the politeness of Canadians. You'll get used to it. It's not a president, it's a prime minister. Americans drink soda. Canadians drink pop. It's not the FBI, it's the Mounties. And they don't always ride horses. Still, if you find yourself in a high-speed chase with a cop on a horse, it's a Mountie. It's not a ton, it's a metric ton, spelled with 2 N's and an E at the end. What's the difference weight-wise? I don't actually know. And neither does anyone. They're not states, they're provinces, and there's 10 of them. There's also the accent. Linguists call it the Canadian vowel lift, but the truth is there's no good explanation for why Canadians say about as if they had been raised somewhere just outside of Glasgow. If you listen carefully, you may even hear the accent in the songs of our top recording artists. Incidentally, Canadian content regulations ensure that you'll be hearing more Justin Bieber and the like than you may have bargained for. Get used to it. In Canada, it's mandated by the government, just like Celine Dion. Perhaps the most widely held misconception Americans have about Canadians is that Canadians speak both French and English. This is simply not true. Most English-speaking Canadians refuse to speak French, just as many Quebecois may not acknowledge your existence if you address them in English. So even a bilingual American might not be at the advantage he or she would expect. You have to learn to use your French and English like a Canadian. For example, if, as you are crossing the border, the immigration officer addresses you in English, reply to him in French. If he then switches to French, assert your right to speak to someone who speaks English. Another difficult adjustment for Americans involves guns, or the lack of them in Canada. I once had the bad luck to be on a Greyhound that was delayed in Niagara Falls on its way to Toronto because the woman in the seat in front of me refused to be persuaded that even if she believed it was her God-given right to carry a semi-automatic firearm in her purse at all times, it was still against the law in Canada. There's also no Office of Homeland Security, which is a huge inconvenience. All this month here in Colorado, my neighbor refused to take down his Christmas lights, even though the festive season was fully over. I made a single phone call.
Don't move! Don't move! Don't move!
The lawn's now properly January drab, but he hasn't been seen since. You can't get anything done that quickly in Canada. In the end, each American contemplating this move has to decide if he or she could adjust to life in Canada, if it's really the kind of country he or she would want to live in. As for me, I'm not going anywhere. And not just because living 24 hours away from my in-laws suits me just fine. My hunch is that most of my neighbors here in Colorado Springs feel the same, even if they have been thinking about moving to Canada. I know that's how I feel. Me, my Canadian wife, and our American children are going to stay right here in our swing state. And in 4 more years, with our citizenship in hand, we'll be feeling pretty much at home, just as we did last November, smiling as we watched America turn, slowly, if reluctantly, into Canada. Legal weed is here, same-sex marriage is practically here, and universal health care can't be far behind. It's good news for all of us. You don't have to move after all.
Car ton bras s'est porté